Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another What If Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. I'm pretty sure at this point that you all absolutely hate me. Based off the poll that we posted to the community page, by an overwhelming margin, you all want to know what would have happened if the Nationalists had actually won the Chinese Civil War. And specifically, in that Colin790, you had requested that I use the Cold War Iron Curtain mod. I hate you for this. I'm letting you know that right now. Not for the question, mind you. It's actually a fascinating point in history that is great to address, but simultaneously, the use of this mod makes it the most painful thing you could possibly try if you were trying to answer this from a serious gaming side. The reason being that this absolutely wonderful mod, and I do mean that as in actually it's a pretty awesome mod, begins in the year 1949, a year in which things for the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, was not exactly going so well here at this time. Yes, I'm sure that many people are already aware that in our timeline, things didn't exactly go the way that the Chinese nationalists wanted. They were driven off of the mainland and forced to relocate to Taiwan, which is where Taiwan actually exists to this day. They are the Republic of China, the former remnants of what once controlled the mainland of China over here. When talking about the events of the Chinese Civil War, this is something that is an absolute mess, and I cannot say that in any kind of way that could possibly speak to the volume of just how much of a mess it truly was. We're talking about a civil war that went on for over 20 years, with the only times of real peace, quote unquote, being back during the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945, where all these varying powers in China, composed of the varying different warlords, had stopped, for the most part, trying to kill each other, and instead all teamed up to try to fight against the Japanese. The Kuomintang itself was horribly corrupt, horribly incompetent, and just about every single thing that you could possibly think that would be wrong with the state was wrong with them. The only reason that the state even functioned as it did for as long as it did, with the warlords not entirely killing each other, is because peace was somewhat kept by virtue of these warlords being given positions within the government by virtue of the fact that they had an army behind them. As you can imagine, in a nation of might makes right, it doesn't mean that anyone is ever actually right in the policies that they try to implement, which in turn over time led to massive amounts of hyperinflation, starvation across the country, horrible corruption from troops not getting paid, not getting food, not getting literally anything that they needed to actually fight a war. And so the idea of the Kuomintang actually winning the Civil War, especially when this mod takes place in 1949, is laughable. Now, that's not to say that them winning the war in general is impossible, but by the time it takes place in this particular mod, it pretty much is. There is literally no way that it can be stopped. So we're going to have to change some context in order to make this actually work. The point in which this mod starts is approximately 3 years after an offensive began by the Kuomintang to specifically retake the northern parts of China, in this case Manchukuo and the region of Manchuria, back from the communists. After the end of World War II and the Japanese would ultimately surrender to the United States, the troops that were still stationed over here in Asia were required to surrender themselves to the Republic of China, what was seen as the official governing body of China. You could say it was what was internationally recognized. But the Chinese communists had been fighting a guerrilla war against the government for literally years at this point, decades. And with the aid of the Soviet Union, they had largely relocated to the north, and then ultimately Japanese soldiers in the region would end up surrendering to them when they couldn't get out fast enough to be able to surrender to the Republic of China or to the Allies. This meant that the Chinese communists, which over the course of years had been ground down to almost nothing, were able to completely bounce back, revitalizing their numbers, getting all of the leftover equipment that the Japanese had left here in the north, and simultaneously take control of a region that was easily the most industrialized in all of China. Like this region right here, this is where pretty much all industrial output for the entirety of China was going to come out of. With the fact that Chiang Kai-shek's government was absolutely horribly corrupt and inept, the United States, which had been backing the Kuomintang during this time, could simply no longer afford to provide all of this military gear, all of this equipment to them that would then end up being stolen by corrupt officials and being sold off for a higher price. So although they did continue to receive some aid from the Americans, it was not nearly as much by the time going into like 1946, 47, 48 as they had in previous years. Thus, it is during this time of like 1946 that the Kuomintang is no longer receiving the aid that it needed in order to keep itself afloat. It is horribly in debt with its loans, it has horrible management, and in an effort to try and fix this and officially end the communist menace once and for all, as well as fix its finances and boost back up its industry, it decides that it is going to launch a massive attack against the communist north, sending in around 1.5 to 2 million soldiers in order to occupy Manchuria. Initially, this move was actually very successful, and the Nationalists managed to take all the way up to like 50, 60, 70 kilometers outside of Harbin. They took almost the entirety of the heavily populated region of Manchuria. The Communists did what they had done best in the previous years, went into the hills as guerrillas, and continued to launch strikes and attacks in order to be able to attack the Kuomintang's weakened supply lines. Pound for pound, shot for shot, during this time, the Kuomintang was overwhelmingly superior to the Communists. And in any scenario that we could be talking about this, not in 1949, but instead more like 1947, this is when you would expect an actual victory for the Kuomintang to occur. But in our timeline, that didn't happen, because what ended up happening is that after a series of very bloody attacks, the Chinese Communists managed to surround several positions of the Kuomintang, causing up to 500,000 men at a time to be surrounded and surrender, which in turn gave massive amounts of equipment to the Communists, as well as a bunch of fighters, hundreds of thousands of them, that would end up defecting to the Communists in order to fight against, well, the Nationalists. Because of all these things, by 1949, a nationalist victory was effectively impossible. All their best equipment, all their best men, all of this was gone. They were horribly in debt, horribly corrupt. There pretty much was no way that they would be able to bounce back at this point. Which means, in this new timeline, we're going to have to change a few things. First off, the hyperinflation crisis is going to have to be addressed. This is something that is unlikely to be fixed very quickly, not likely at all. The best way that we could kind of change things is that instead of having corrupt officials go and take over the banks in Manchuria as they did, that the Kuomintang, for whatever reason, somehow during this time is maybe a little bit less corrupt. I don't know, we will see. The next thing that we have to go ahead and here and do is have some of this territory be taken back. Like, namely, we had to delete the army of the communist forces. Yes, we're not playing this mod out entirely real, I understand that, but by virtue of the scenario that we have to create in order to make the Kuomintang win in the first place, we need this territory back real quick. If you are legit playing this mod and you somehow, as Nationalist China, manage to retain control of Shanghai during this time, you actually get to remove the majority of the debuffs that are affecting you. But hell, by the time this actually takes place in 1949, this is not going to be happening for the Nationalists. They are in a terrible position. Instead, what we will say is that by the year 1949 comes around, the Nationalists will have been fighting in northern China for years. The Communists are never able to break through, they're never able to surround the nationalist positions, and during this entire time, resources are continuously being drained from the nationalist forces, who in turn are suffering from terrible food, from hyperinflation, from all of these things. The people are starving. But because the Communists never actually have a breakthrough to surround hundreds of thousands of men of the Kuomintang, they're still able to hold on. The Communists during this time were levying literally millions of men and throwing them into combat. Oftentimes, they were very poorly equipped, very poorly trained, and usually if we're talking trades, we're talking about 2 to 3 communists dying for every 1 nationalist. Eventually, these breakthroughs would happen, but in the timeline that we're creating now, it doesn't, meaning that the CCP's forces are continuously getting bled out. That's not to say that they won't have any supplies, mind you. The entire time that this is happening, the CCP in our timeline and what would be happening here is that they would be getting funded by the Soviet Union. In fact, from the 700,000 Japanese soldiers that had been in Manchuria at the time, their surrender allowed the Soviet Union to give massive amounts of old equipment to the CCP in order to continue its fight against the nationalists. Ironically, during this time, the nationalists did not actually have a very bad relationship with the Soviet Union, and one of the things that Joseph Stalin had tried to do in this time is to make Mao Zedong please form a coalition government with the nationalists. No one really thought that the CCP was going to be able to take over everything as easily as they did in our timeline, so it was better to just have a coalition government and achieve some level of peace and stability. Mao Zedong, ultimately, after making some gains against the nationalists, would refuse this, And so that is why, in our timeline, that didn't actually happen. Instead, the communists were actually able to go in and take over everything. As a result of everything that I've described, the war would effectively reach a stalemate. The other change that would likely have to occur during this time is that despite in our timeline the Americans stopping most of their aid, in this new timeline, if not large amounts of aid, at least more is given to the Republic of China than what occurred in our timeline. Thus it is, perhaps moving into 1948, 1949, maybe even 1950, right before the outbreak of the Korean War, that this is where we see something very, very different. You see the news article that popped up right here, Soviet intervention in the Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union and its ally Mongolia recently intervened in the Chinese Civil War to prevent a total collapse of the People's Republic of China as it struggled to hold back the Republic of China. After intense fighting, a ceasefire emerged. Mongolia has taken control of Inner Mongolia, calling it a buffer zone from Chinese aggression, and at the same time, the PRC, with Soviet support, have established control in Beijing, its surrounding areas, and Manchuria. In the west, Shanqing has joined East Turkestan, and the rest of China, including most of the industrial base and ethnic Han population, is under control of the Republic of China. The uneasy ceasefire is currently holding, but both sides are expected to rebuild their arsenals and plan for future resolution of the conflict in their favor. Yes, this is actually the most likely thing to happen in this new timeline. The Republic of China does not necessarily win the Civil War. The Nationalists are not able to fully cement this. It would be impossible in our timeline to think of them somehow magically attaining a grand victory. Yes, we could create a hypothetical, but the most likely scenario in all of this is that eventually, after this back and forth stalemate, the Soviet Union eventually intervenes and manages to secure the peace that they wanted. If not a coalition government being formed, then what would happen is a situation that is similar to the idea of North and South Korea, of there being a southern China that is supported by the United States and is in turn Republican, if we want to call it that. It's very loosely, considering that it's, definitely a dictatorship at this time, while the North is still held and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. If anyone is wondering why the Kuomintang would even accept this in the first place, the short answer is because they are in a state of near economic ruin as it is. Years of war with the Japanese, followed by years of war with the Chinese Communists, not to mention the years of war that they already faced even prior to these conflicts breaking out, meant that the state itself was already on the verge of collapse. Thus, peace would allow the Nationalists to be able to stabilize their nation, build up their forces, and from there, hopefully, be able to take the fight to the communists again in the future. When talking about this kind of scenario, this is perhaps the easiest kind of setup that I could have ever done, because this is an event that is not starting in 1936. We were already starting in 1949. Thus, it's just explaining how something like this could happen. The question really becomes, what happens because of this? Even with a nationalist quote-unquote victory, it's not like their problems with agriculture, their severe hyperinflation, and their issues with banditry and everything else are going to simply go away. That's not the case. The immediate thing that would have to happen as an uneasy peace would settle over the nation is that the military would have to be sharply reduced. Both in the case of the CCP and the Nationalists, neither one could afford long-term the sheer number of troops that they had put onto the battlefield. That simply wasn't something that they could afford anymore. The food, the equipment, every single thing going into this, it was insane, and as such, military reductions would likely occur. Yes, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people were lost in the conflict with the communists, but simultaneously, again, for every loss that the Nationalists faced, the communists also likely lost 2 to 3 times more. As such, a reduction of military personnel and primarily relating them back to garrison duty would in turn allow the state to stabilize, not have to pay those troops as much, and simultaneously would mean that they weren't going to be as threatened due to the fact that, well, most of the communist forces were already dead. At the same time that this hyperinflation is addressed, the next course of action would be to try and stabilize the state and remove control from the warlords, individuals that for the longest time have hampered the growth of nationalist China as it was. In the case of some warlords, concessions would likely be offered to give them positions within the government, or at least retirement packages, so to speak, while in the case of others, they would simply be bribed or maybe even shot. In order for nationalist China to survive in this timeline, it has to modernize its state, something that is going to take a long time, with much difficulty, and likely would take decades if it is not just utterly impossible. From this, efforts would be then put in place in order to try and rebuild and recoup the losses of war, building back infrastructure, and helping the lower classes, though land reform is something that is most certainly questionable by this point as to whether or not it would occur. And the nation would move from total mobilization down to only being partially mobilized, thus able to react to the event that war breaks out, but simultaneously trying to dedicate itself more back towards civilian construction. With a quote-unquote victory by the Nationalists, or at least partial victory in this case, what would likely happen is that the United States would once again return to funneling money into China. They would participate in the Marshall Plan, which in turn would allow the economy to be rebuilt, and all of this would be done in an effort to try and build a bulwark against more communist influence. With China's new participation in the Marshall Plan, this would in turn allow for it to begin to modernize its agricultural sector. Even over the course of our timeline, China had been heavily dependent upon its agricultural sector. Until it was able to modernize going into the 1980s, the overwhelming majority of its economy was based around this kind of production. Yes, the CCP in our timeline had tried to move things along with the Great Leap Forward, but that had largely ended in disaster for agriculture, for industry, for pretty much everything, resulting in up to 40 million people dying. In this case, because it's not being done in a communist system, instead it is being supported through outside capitalist investment, it is likely to go significantly better, as it is not going to be done with horrible ideological thought behind scientific agricultural production. For anyone who's confused about what I'm talking about, we're talking about the idea where seeds of the same class won't compete for resources because they won't participate in class warfare. Yes, there were very dumb communist ideas that were included in agriculture that make no sense, I know. As nationalist China is modernizing with the aid of the United States, this is where the Soviet Union would likely pour all of its aid and resources into everything that it can to do with the CCP in order to shore up its defenses, but simultaneously focus those efforts into the Korean Workers' Party. They want to maintain North Korea. With the establishment of the Korean Workers' Party, this latest act continues the consolidation of communist leadership around Kim Il-sung, and this comes after recent party Congress declared North Korea as a bastion of democracy and approved a constitution establishing an independent, united Korea with Seoul as the capital. With one party, it appears North Korea is finalizing its efforts to lay the groundwork for a unification of the Korean peninsula under communist rule. So it is then moving into the year 1950 that nationalist China would likely commit to its own 4-year plan. Peace is going to be the name of the game at this point. There really is no way for them to be able to involve themselves with outside affairs except in the most limited amounts possible. With the launching of the 4-year plan, it is thus time to address the warlord question, which, on that note, you all can probably see here from this mod that everything in here is missing data. The reason being is that no one actually expects you to be able to win as the nationalist in this time. So I do appreciate that they do actually have a focus tree for it. That is nice. Simultaneously, this is quite broken to look at. But it's important to understand what would happen with the direction that the Kuomintang would go into at this time. Many alternate history scenarios would likely have the Kuomintang going and reforming itself, becoming more democratic, and from this following the same path that they did in our timeline with Taiwan. Which, yes, it probably would go somewhat like it did with Taiwan. The problem with that, though, is that Taiwan remained effectively a dictatorship for many years until the son of Chiang Kai-shek, I believe it was, is the guy who ended up democratizing. That's the word. He made the system more democratic. As such, rather than open itself up to reform, what is likely to happen as the Korean War breaks out and communists are surrounding them is that the Kuomintang will clamp down further on the idea of, well, free elections. This would be a dictatorship that would be supported by the United States even as war breaks out with Korea. It is all the more important at this time that Korea is supported and that China is supported against the northern parts of both communist parties. As such, the Kuomintang would likely deny any need to reform. Reform is clearly not needed in the glorious Chinese government. We are strong, and we took back the mainland without any of the new reforms. They're simply not necessary. The interesting thing, though, is what exactly would happen in the case of war between North and South Korea. South Korea in our timeline was significantly weaker than the North initially, until they received support from the Americans. What happened after that, then, is that a combined South Korean and American force was able to push well into North Korea, almost to the border itself here with China, where then the communists, the People's Republic of China, sent over 1 million troops across the border in order to be able to aid North Korea. While they would likely send some aid, simultaneously in this new timeline in which the Republic of China exists, in which the nationalists won, that means that not nearly as many men, that means not nearly as much equipment, that means not nearly as much of anything is available for them to send across. As such, it is very possible that South Korea ends up actually winning this war, with the Soviet Union not able to support the North enough during this time period. Despite the fact that the country would not be reformed, it does simultaneously make sense that China during this time would try to lift martial law, this being because it wants to encourage outside investment to specifically build up its industrial base. As for what would happen after that, instead of empowering the cliques to increase their presence and control over individual territories, bribes and other things would have already been offered during this time. Instead, it would make sense that with the new, more autocratic reforms that the Kuomintang would put in place, or rather lack of reforms, that instead they would clamp down on and specifically try to take over and control the cliques versus giving them free reign. After all, they don't want any more warlords to create more trouble in the nation. As this happens, the gradual territory around China itself is able to be integrated into the state, with direct control under the autocratic rule of Chiang Kai-shek. Maybe then some change will actually be able to happen. The really interesting thing to note about this time period is that China is likely to receive a huge boost by the Korean War, just as Japan did in our timeline. For anyone who is curious, who hasn't seen my video that I did on the History of Everything podcast page talking about this geopolitical thing, because of the Korean War, a bunch of supplies were bought off of Japan, which in turn helped boost the Japanese economy over the course of the 1950s. This same thing would likely happen in China, as Chinese goods would be bought up in large amounts in order to be able to quickly transport across over to Korea, and thus be able to supply the troops in this war. This influx of cash would actually allow the Chinese state to provide the bribes that it needed to control the warlords, and simultaneously do something to fix its economy, which would still be in a very horrible position by this time period. So we have the Central Reform Committee. A new Central Reform Committee has been established to better direct the future political developments of the Republic and reform the KMT. The new committee will avoid the ineptness and corruption of previous executive committees by encouraging educated, young, highly motivated party members to lead the effort and revitalize the party. It is unknown which faction of the party will dominate the committee and the Republic. Chiang Kai-shek is a proven leader, promising to continue his hardline approach of centralizing the state and suppressing political dissent. Li Zhongren, a military commander and rival of Chiang, offers a more democratic version for China with more civil liberties, and the famed general Sun Li-jin believes in extensive party reforms and are orienting the foreign policy and state structures to the United States. When we look at this, considering that the Marshall Plan is taking effect, it makes sense that China would have to do some type of reforms in order to be able to continue to get aid. However, simultaneously, I don't see this as being something that Chiang Kai-shek would ever actually allow. He is going to specifically want to take the state down his own kind of hardline vision, which in turn is likely to invite trouble from the United States. In our timeline, one of the things that had been proposed was that the US wanted to assassinate Chiang Kai-shek in the early 1940s, specifically because he was so incompetent as well as corrupt. As a result of that, considering that Sun Li-jin has the option down here to invite CIA advisors, it would make sense if during this time period that the United States would funnel massive amounts of money, time, effort, and research to specifically affect how China would develop. But perhaps this is wishful thinking, that the Chinese will simply embrace American influence. That is less likely to happen. Instead, limited reforms under Li Zhongren is more likely in the scenario. As this is happening, the next step would be to address and remove the bandits that are plaguing the country. One of the things that is happening with all these bandits is that many are former military members, individuals who, due to not getting paid, not getting enough food, not getting enough of anything, they left their life in the military and went and became bandits. With more aid being received by the United States, as well as simultaneously an improving economy, this means that not only are the military forces more likely to be better paid and also loyal now, but simultaneously the people who are bandits are more than likely going to end up getting clamped down upon. The temporary provisions can thus be amended. After a campaign that would last many months, perhaps even potentially years, eventually order would return to the countryside. As it says right here, order must be restored in the rural regions of China, those particularly targeted by local warlords or communists who are not loyal to the new government. We will do everything in our power to ensure the safety and security of our rural regions. It is also very possible that many of the members of these bandit groups are not even actual real bandits. They are retinue forces of varying different warlords that, technically speaking, were loyal to the government, but now that the central government is cracking down upon these warlords, their forces are going to be suppressed. At the same time, opium usage is going to have to be fought. One of the things that happened in our timeline, though they deny it to this day, is that the CCP, during this point, was able to get large amounts of funds to be able to fund their guerrilla activities, specifically from engaging in the opium trade. With the centralization of authority by the state, this trade is going to need to be cracked down upon, lest it affect the, internal stability of the country. Along with this, there still remains the issue of communists in the countryside. Just because the communist forces have primarily been defeated, it does not mean that much in the same way as we saw with North Korea going going into South Korea and North Vietnam going into South Vietnam, that this means communist agents are still going to be moving throughout the region, trying to destabilize varying different cities and turn the people against the central government. Whether or not these anti-communist activities would actually be successful, well, that's another question entirely. Yes, the Republic of China government recently launched a campaign to stomp out dissent and threats to the state. The police and other state agencies have already opened investigations of politicians, writers, activists, and intellectuals accused of either sympathizing with or openly supporting enemies of the state. In particular, the focus appears to be on communist sympathizers and criminal elements. Many human rights activists are expressing concern that this new crackdown on dissent will mark a white terror and will be used to crush any threat to the ruling party at the expense of individual or political rights. Yes, the things that are likely to happen at this point is a crackdown on organized crime and the crushing of secret societies, while simultaneously liquidating any communists that are still within the nation. So it is then with a significantly weakened communist Chinese force to the north that North Korea would eventually more than likely get overrun. There would no longer be a 1,000,000-man volunteer army that is able to pour over the border and be able to push the United Nations forces back. Instead, South Korea would end up taking over the north, unifying it simply as the Republic of Korea. Between the actions of the losses of the Chinese Communist Party and now the loss of North Korea, these would be two massive blows to the prestige of the Soviet Union. I cannot even begin to predict at this time what would exactly happen here, as we're talking about things that could destabilize the rule of Joseph Stalin, and from that, perhaps give even further support to nations that were occupied specifically by the Soviets and had their own communist puppets put in charge. There are simply too many possibilities here. There's also the idea that one of the things that MacArthur had wanted in this time, General MacArthur for the Americans, is that he wanted to continue on the invasion and specifically go and take out the Chinese. He wanted to nuke China in this time. Of course, it wouldn't happen in our new timeline because the Republic of China is the one that is actually in charge, not the People's Republic of China, but there is a real possibility that, yes, the CCP might be invaded by American forces. If that happened, it could possibly in turn lead to further war with the Soviet Union, which is why it is also very possible at that time that MacArthur's plan would, once again, just as it was in our timeline, be shot down. Moving on from all that, I'm sure that many people are already aware that the Chinese people suffered horrible abuses at the hands of the Japanese over the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. As a result, the trials that would occur once peace had actually settled for those who had collaborated with them and allowed for rampant murder among other things would still likely take place, despite the fact that the US would want China to limit its activities, considering that Japan served as a good bulwark against communist forces. Whether or not that would actually be necessary now with the fall of North Korea and the reduced weakening of communism in the area, that also possibly means that the Americans won't lend nearly as much support to the Japanese as they did in our own timeline, thus allowing these kinds of trials to take place in the first place. One of the key reasons that likely would happen is that the US would probably see China as a much greater potential ally, considering the rise of communist guerrillas and forces within the region of like Cambodia, Laos, and others. Having China immediately on their border is something that would serve as a very valuable ally. That's right, we're getting into the Vietnam War now at this point. And just like what happened in our timeline with the CCP, it makes sense that the Kuomintang would launch a kind of Sinization campaign, something that wanted to turn the outerlying regions of China into a single unified force under the Chinese way of life. Really, when we talk about all this, there isn't all that much difference between the state oppressive actions of the Kuomintang and the CCP, except ideologically, they're less likely to screw things up in regards to modernization. The oppression is still most certainly going to be there. So it is here then, heading into 1951, perhaps maybe even 1952, that finally some degree of land reform would likely take place within the Kuomintang. One of the big reasons that the CCP had been so incredibly popular among the lower classes is that in comparison to the established Chinese forces, the CCP had stripped much of the land away from many landlords and given said land to landless peasants, a classification of people that, as you can imagine, made up the overwhelming majority of Chinese society. This earned them a lot of goodwill. In order to maintain peace and stability within the region with constant communist agitation, it would make sense that eventually, under limited reforms, as long as Chiang Kai-shek is not the guy who's actually in charge, that something is going to occur that will allow for these to occur within the nation. Whether or not these would be half measures, though, or committed actual land reforms, it's up to to interpretation. For the sake of a more positive timeline, we will say that China does in fact commit to land reform during this point. It is also true that in an effort to combat communism around the world, that the United States already by this time was specifically applying pressure to European powers in an effort to decolonize. As such, they would likely also put pressure upon, say, China to actually do something in order to help said peasants. Of course, the way that this land reform is going to take place is likely going to vary. As an example, landlords will be compensated for the land that is taken, but simultaneously, even though it doesn't show over on here, anyone who actually collaborated with the Japanese is probably still going to have their land seized. Because landlords are still a crucial part of the Kuomintang government, and these are not full reforms, it does not make sense that they would go and liquidate and just start seizing land from anyone and everyone. Instead, they would try to persuade who it is that they could, and at the same time leave more autonomy for the cliques who are out on the frontier, specifically because they know that they cannot control nearly as much of this. Because of that, reforms are likely to be a mixed bag, with the greatest amount of them occurring within the central Chinese region along the east coast. With these reforms and some redistribution of land, it would make sense at that point that the state would begin to heavily invest in agricultural production, doing anything that it could in order to get supplies from the Marshall Plan in order to be able to invest in tractors and other things that are needed to mechanize and actually become competitive. All the while this is happening, the French would of course be continuously fighting Vietnam. As communist forces are rising in the north, this in turn is something that would be kept an eye on, but for a time, this is up for the French to actually do something about the entire situation. It is at this time that China would be developing itself further, rebuilding much of its infrastructure, that the United States would launch its mutual security plan. Something that, much like in the case of the Marshall Plan designed to rebuild Europe and other places, that this would allow for further investments to go in and actually develop the industrial and military capabilities of China and others. Eventually, just as in our timeline, Joseph Stalin would eventually die. And though the war in Vietnam would rage on, although communist northern China would still be trying to bide its time during this time, for nationalist China this wouldn't necessarily matter, as during this time period they would just be continuing to modernize and industrialize. There would be no great leap forward, there would be nothing like that, but with continuous developments and investments that would come from the outside, this means that China would see a gradual development over time that would allow it to properly industrialize. One of the developments that would likely happen during this time would be initial researches into nuclear energy. The Chinese had done this historically in our timeline. The difference here is that they're not going to be heavily supported by the Soviet Union, and it's unlikely that the United States would want China to actually develop its own nuclear weapons. Still, it makes sense that it would help it at least with degrees of some research, though much of this would be kept close guarded. So it is then that by the mid-1950s, nationalist China would likely see a greater reduction in the presence and power of the varying cliques that existed within the government. The CC clique faction within the KMT has seen a major drop in its influence and power within the Republic of China. Many of its prominent leaders are facing corruption charges or being removed from key posts. Media reports highlight some of the military and political figures of CC clique leaders of the last few decades. The CC clique represents the right wing of the KMT and established a reputation for being virulently anti-communist, anti-Japanese. However, the new democratization reforms have opened positions to other groups, and many reformers view the CC clique as the old guard that must be replaced if China is to prosper. Reformers hope that the weakening of the CC clique will enable a smooth transition to democracy. CC clique leaders warn rapid reforms will lead to instability and misgovernance. With the completion of the first four-year plan during this time, combined with limited land reform as well as reform within the government, this means that China would have seen steady growth over the course of this time period. The sheer amount of funds that would have come from outside forces seeking additional cheap labor would have drastically escalated the economy of this time. France also would have likely been buying resources from China as well as supplies in order to be able to fuel its war with Vietnam. Something that would have actually gone significantly better for them, considering that there would have been no communist forces immediately to the north that could have been able to assist them. With that, the Nationalists would more than likely launch their second four-year plan, and at the same time prepare for possible intervention within Indochina. Now, the nation was significantly more back on its feet. Eventually though, while we cannot necessarily guarantee what would happen, it is still very possible that the French would end up getting defeated. World War II, after all, had pretty much broken France financially, and the idea of a continuous fight and war being waged across the ocean in Vietnam was not something that would necessarily be sustainable. Even without additional help from communists supplying Ho Chi Minh's forces, the French would eventually possibly get kicked out. It's really anyone's guess as to what would happen there. And with the resumption of hostilities between North and South Vietnam then, The question is, how would nationalist China react? It is highly unlikely, considering how many times nationalist forces would have preached against imperialism, or at least against European imperialism, that they would end up supporting the French. Instead, South Vietnam would likely end up being supported, as well as the more nationalist elements within it. Very possibly in an effort to weaken the North, Vietnamese leaders in the North would have potentially been assassinated, though this obviously could not be proven as to who by. Honestly, at the time that I do all this now, there is nothing else to really do in the focus tree. We have done pretty much everything, and it is heading into 1956. What would likely happen after everything here is that Tibet's sovereignty, what would likely happen following all of this is that eventually northern Vietnam would fall. No matter how much aid the Soviet Union gives, they cannot risk war with the United States, and without a communist neighbor to the north to help, this means that nationalist China is going to be able to assist the forces of the United States, or France, or southern Vietnam, and be able to take them out from this side. Whether or not Tibet actually remains independent is another question entirely. Technically speaking, nationalist China, though they would want to put Tibet as a kind of protected state under them, simultaneously it doesn't necessarily make sense that they would launch an invasion of Tibet like the PRC did. Doing such an action could potentially isolate them on the world stage, and they will not want this, as they will still need defense from potentially the communists to the north. As for the remainder of it, well, in this world, the Soviet Union would have had its international position significantly weakened. It would have been significantly more isolated without a trade partner to the south in the form of China, and from there, you can likely guarantee that they would be significantly more aggressive with any of their neighbors around them, seeing failure after failure after failure. It is possible in this world that the Soviet Union would likely take more risks, leading to further escalations, and from that, who knows really what could happen in a world of nuclear war. Needless to say, the embarrassment of the East, the somehow rise of nationalist China, would make sure that they were constantly watching their back. With that, my friends, I think that there's not really much else that we can do. This is a fascinating mod, and I find it so interesting to be able to tell an alternate history story from this perspective, even if at times it is significantly more restrictive than what we would see normally in other kinds of versions of the game. Still, let me know what it is that you think about this scenario. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and make sure to put your comments in the comment section below that list what kind of what-if scenario we should do next. The top 5 that get put in there with the most likes, I will go ahead and put that up on a poll so that you can determine the next one that we do. My friends, thank you all very much for watching. I will see you all next time, and goodbye, guys.